Hello, my name is Dave Vollmer, and I'm going to continue with our history lesson, high school history lesson, which also highlights the great value of note taking and summarizing. So, picking it up from here, we're going to continue to use our webbing or our graphical based notes. We're going to shift to a different category or set of problems. We're going to continue to leave the other problems highlighted again. But now we're going to try to introduce some structured note taking where in general the students will have a handout. We'll use this sort of simple fill in the blanks to kind of guide them, hand that out before the readings, and sort of help point them in the direction of what's important to try to pick up from these sections in chapter 14. So they'll have that in advance of the readings. Hopefully they'll be able to work through it, and then in class we can just go through these and talk about different options and ask some leading questions and basically go through and fill this out in some teacher prepared notes, which we hand out ahead of time. And hopefully, again, that points them to things like the section on taxes, to focus in on that and to take what can be a pretty daunting display of details and whittle it down to what truly is important. Moving on from there, again, we'll go back to the summarizing techniques, which really are a great guiding philosophy. That this time we'll use a definition frame, and it'll take a look at one section of the government problems here and focus in on the government fiscal policy and ask some questions that this particular summarizing strategy highlights. First, asking what general category it belongs to, put some different thought processes and connections together. Well, it's put forth by both the executive and legislative branches. What characteristics separate from other items? In this, it's not just domestic, it also deals with some things in the world, so that guiding the students again to try and wrap their arms or a little better around what government fiscal policy is, give some different classes or some components of it, interest rate management, tariffs, banks, and then finally put together a consolidated statement from each of these four segments of the definition frame, which reads consistently and again helps put the concepts together in a single consolidated statement that'll take maybe several pages or at least several paragraphs of information and summarizes it much more succinctly and understandably. Moving on from there, we'll use our same web graphic for continuity. Highlight across. Now we're going to be looking at a different category, which is the workforce problems, and start again with using images and pictures along with a lead into the combination format of note taking. And of particular interest, some of these things in retrospect seem a bit intuitive, but really focusing on the process of note taking is something that I think has, at least in my education, historically been sort of weak. And framing it as notes being just the beginning, and to be a living document from there that you annotate, highlight, underline, and even add some pictures or some connections really helps the retention and putting together some things in combination. So again, we'll do that. In this case, we're going to use a little bit different of a web format or a graphical depiction of the notes, where we're going to start with a Venn diagram, and we've basically laid out workforce problems. They're going to be rural categories and urban categories, and we'll be working through sort of a blank Venn diagram and allow the students to first populate the things they can think of that would kind of exclusively apply to the rural category, maybe some things that exclusively apply to the urban category, and then of course the things that would impact both rural and urban life. And we would have this as a leading in exercise and then pretty much go through these things and explain maybe some of the reasons why one way or the other the causes fit rural and urban, and really work through a graphical depiction of that to help drive the point home. shift a little more to a different set of problems, the consumer problems and causes of the Great Depression. Lead with some images here to kind of get the students thinking, and kind of as a lead in and a preview to another note-taking strategy, which is again teacher prepared notes, but this time it would be a blank table with some leading and some cues to what's important. And it may list the factors over here to the left, but get the students thinking on, was that something that really happened during or after or before the actual onset of the stock market crash and the depression? Again, some anchoring pictures to sort of drive the concept home on, what it may mean, and allow the notes to be a little more living and not just dry text. And then a little bit of higher level thinking here, where we start to talk about, is it a small, medium, or large impact, to try to do some relative comparison. And this may be a good portion of the lesson where we have some open discussion, try to engage the students with some not just one way, but as much two-way learning as possible, and involve them in the preparation of the lesson. We have opportunities then to talk about the global problems, which again takes us back to another summarizing strategy. That particular set of problems we thought was a little more conducive to the topic restriction illustration frame, which again kind of expertly guides the students through a process to take what's a rather detailed set of paragraphs and information and kind of whittle it down to a overall overarching good summary. So you start off with what are the global causes, what's the restriction of those. They'll have elements outside of the United States, most deal with either Europe or Asia. What's an illustration? And we talk a little bit about how after World War I there was a series of circular payments where Germany couldn't pay some countries, and those countries then couldn't pay other countries, and it was kind of a vicious cycle, and give a little bit of an illustration there. And then tie these three factors into a continuous statement, which helps really codify the global causes of the Great Depression into a single statement. And again, taking a very broad, maybe sometimes detailed category, and working with the students on how to take it down into something much more digestible there. So finally, one of the very interesting things that we tried to apply for the chapter was a little bit of higher level learning, where we look ahead and we ask a leading question in terms of what were some of the factors leading to a better outcome in the 2008 financial crisis than maybe what was seen in the Great Depression. And we have an article identified here out of the Washington Post, which starts off and tells the students, hey, it started out worse, and it kind of lays out the reasons why it's worse and all, and lays that out. And we would have that as an assignment leading into the presentation of the lesson, so the students were familiar with it. But then we would go into the reciprocal teaching technique and exercise that Chapter 5 talked about. And ideally what we would do is maybe work through a little bit of a simpler exercise or article in advance, a topic that the students are familiar with, maybe even something out of the school newspaper that is really easily identifiable on the details, and break out into groups of 4 students. And as a complete class, we would together take on the summarizer, questioner, clarifier, and predictor role of the article from the student newspaper, but then really shift into breaking out in groups of 4. And kind of after they're familiar with this reciprocal teaching exercise technique, float around and just assign each student one of the roles. The first student would read the passage and just summarize the key points. The second student's job would be to ask questions to try to clarify things that aren't clear, or maybe other important information from the article, and at the same time trying to harken back to what we learned during the Great Depression article to be able to apply that forward. The third student, or the clarifier, would be charged with going through and taking terms like Benjamin Bernanke or terms and folks and saying who they are and what the Federal Reserve person does, and maybe some of the other industry specific terms, and having those identified. And then the fourth student would really just predict. And some of this is a bit of hindsight because we know how the 2008 crisis played out, and it was fortunately less tragic and major impacts on American society and what the Depression did. But that doesn't underscore the amount of suffering and economic loss that happened. And so we may either just have ask the predictor to predict how they thought based on what's in the article, or also look towards future economic crises. And hopefully that would be a good article, a good exercise that not only helps drive forth lessons learned on the Depression, but also goes ahead and applies it in terms of how it's important going forward in their lives. Finally, we'll have a slide with a couple interesting things here, everything from symbols used by people who were out of work and kind of nomadically floating around, some other global effects, and just different things from the chapter that we pulled that are kind of interesting things that may spark additional interest. We have a video here that they could watch and learn some things there in terms of further enrichment, and kind of drive some things more and try to start that spark in history that so often can happen there in high school that can lead to a lifelong learning. So hopefully what we've shown is that we're able to not only deliver the content and deliver the lesson, but also the key techniques that we're here in classroom instruction that works in terms of note-taking and summarizing in specific summary frames that will help the student not only in our class but in other classes, both in their current and future learnings.